Okay, welcome back everybody. Let's dive in. So again, the end is nigh. We are approaching the end of the course, the end of the semester. For some of you, approaching the end of your undergraduate career. Lots of endings and new beginnings. Okay, so specifically in this course, you have reached the end of us telling you what to do in the final project. You now have between now and the evening of Monday, May the 9th. My apologies, I had the day and the dates mixed up there. Monday, May the 9th, by 11:59 p.m., you're delivering all of the materials and documents for the final project to Blackboard. The following Tuesday, May 10th, bright and early, 7:30 in the morning, we are going to meet here and we are going to witness 62.5-minute presentations, and you're going to see lots of different robots, some performing better than others. Yeah. I don't get to choose the exam time, so if you're not a morning person, prepare yourselves. Okay, so I mentioned this last time. Between now and the final project presentation, you have a lot of freedom here to try and demonstrate that some change to robot, evolutionary algorithm, neural network, and so on makes a change. And that change should not be obvious to us, that it would confer an advantage on the evolutionary algorithm's ability to evolve that behavior into your robot, right? A bad A/B test is, I propose, that making the motors 100 times stronger will make it easier for the evolutionary algorithm to evolve forward locomotion for my robot. That is not a good A/B test, right? Something where it's not obvious to us beforehand which of your two algorithm variants is likely to do better. Another not so great A/B test is, here's one fitness curve of A and here's one fitness curve of B. The fitness curve for B is below that of A, therefore B is worse than A, right? You're going to have to convince us through data collection of multiple runs of A and B. That's why we've given you 2 weeks between now and the final exam period to do so. Okay. I spoke quite a bit about it this last week. Any other questions or things that have come up? Yes?
Will we get feedback on what our A/B testing is from deliverable 4?
From deliverable 4, yes, you will. Yes, you'll get some feedback. Feedback, do you have a particular type of feedback in mind? Just whether that's a good test or not?
Yeah, it's a solid test.
Okay, yes, we will give you feedback on whether if it's completely obvious to us that one of them is going to do better than the other, we will let you know. Any other questions? Okay. I will bring this up at the beginning of each of the remaining 4 classes to just set aside a few minutes at the beginning of class. If there's any questions or comments, anything you want me to clarify, please do so. Please let me know. Okay. Any other questions about the final project? Okay, it's a bit of a challenge to organize and run through 60 presentations in less than 3 hours. So in the final class, I will again go over the logistics of what exactly is going to happen here in class on Tuesday morning, May the 10th. So we'll make sure that everyone knows what they're doing. It's like staging a play. It's important that everybody knows what they're doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it. And if so, we'll be able to get through all the presentations smoothly. Okay. All right. So we are going to finish up lecture 23 shortly, over the next few minutes, which will conclude our section on collective robotics, where we've been looking at a particular aspect of intelligence, which is my ability to realize that there is something I want to do in the world that's beyond my ability to do it on my own. So I can try and recruit others to help me or produce more copies of myself, and the resulting team might be able to do something that's beyond the ability of any one robot, organism, and so on. That will take us into the final section of this course, where we're going to look at evolutionary algorithms, in which the investigators broaden the scope of the evolutionary algorithm. The evolutionary algorithm is going to be able to tinker with and optimize not just the neural controller of the robot, but more and more aspects of the robot's body. We're going to look at the very first attempt in which this was done in lecture 24. In lecture 25, we're going to look at broadening the evolutionary algorithm again. So now it's not just tinkering with brain and body, it's actually manipulating the material properties out of what the robot is made of. We're going to look at an evolution that is evolutionary algorithms that are able to soften and stiffen various parts of the robot. Soft robotics is an emerging branch of robotics over just the last few years. So we're sort of getting caught up to the present day in the state of the art of robotics. And then the last two lectures will look not at rigid robots or soft robots, but bio robots. Robots that are made completely from living tissue. Yeah? Okay. That's where we are and where we're going. All right, so back to self-replication for a moment. Again, whenever we're talking about self-replication, a bit of a proviso, there are considerable ethical challenges around making machines that can make more machines. For our purposes, we are focusing just on the academic side of this. How do we actually create machines that do so? Whether we would want to do so, how we would regulate that technology, that's a discussion for another day. We ended last time by looking at this physical robot, and we then looked at a simulation, or simplified simulation of this robot. A few things to just remind ourselves of here. We're going to look at a robot that's made up of a bunch of cubes. There is one motor inside each cube, and that motor can rotate the two halves of that cube along the grand diagonal. Inside each cube, there is a controller that is dictating what the robot does based on what it senses. So we're also looking at a collective robot system here, right? The robot here is actually the cube, and each of the parent and child robots that you see here are robots made of robots. Each cube is drawing power from this base plate, and that power is allowing it to run the controller, which causes that cube to move, or that cube passes electric power onto its neighboring units. Those neighboring units are connecting together with magnets. It can pass power into these neighboring units, and when a unit receives power, it starts running the controller as well. In this particular case, every single physical cube is running exactly the same controller, but clearly they're not all doing exactly the same thing at the same time. Why not?
They have a relative, they have merely like a relative perception of each other.
They have a relative perception of each other, right? Each has an identical controller, but at any point in time, each unit, each cube has its own sensation or its own perception, right? We haven't talked about what the sensors are here on this robot, but each cube sees or senses something different, usually, during each time step, which causes it to do something different, right? Okay, this is just self-replication. Self-replication here has been built in. So the graduate student who worked on this project, he spent a lot of time manually designing the controller so that when that controller was dropped into these blocks, and he provides additional blocks in just the right place at just the right time, you get self-replication. We ended last time by looking at a simulated version of this, where in this case the investigators take even one step further back, and they are not going to manually program the controllers. They're going to search for controllers that actually produce self-replication. So we're not building in any evolution. There's no evolutionary algorithm here. We're not even building in the ability to self-replicate. We're going to look at the conditions under which self-replication arises. So this is still a robotics experiment, but it's a very strange robotics experiment. It's meant to indirectly study the origins of life. Under what conditions will a system start to self-replicate? And once a process starts to self-replicate and has a couple of additional components, evolution can also start, and off you go. Okay, so in this simulation, they're making several simplifying assumptions compared to the hardware. The first one is that this is going to be a mostly two-dimensional robot. Each cube in the robot is cut along the diagonal, and each cube can rotate around its diagonal. When it does, this two-dimensional robot for a moment becomes three-dimensional. So if you imagine that this particular cube here starts to rotate along its BC-AD axis, these 2.5 cubes here rotate up and out of the plane, out of the screen, and then back into the screen. And now in this particular cube here, C is next to A and B is next to D. Everybody see that? Okay, so imagine we've got a whole bunch of these 2D robots, and every once in a while when one of them moves, a part of the robot rotates out of the plane and then back into the plane. Yeah? These are still robots. They're being controlled by a controller. That controller is receiving sensation as input, and it is producing actions as outputs, like we've seen many, many times before. In most of what we've seen so far, that controller is a neural network, and that's what you coded up in your final project. In this particular study, the controller is not a neural network. It is a set of binary trees. There are 3 of these binary trees inside each cube. We started last time talking about the first of these binary trees. Every binary tree, by the name, by definition of the name, has 2 nodes associated with it. And the binary trees that we're going to look in here have a maximum depth of 4. I don't think I'll draw the entire depth here. We're going to go down to a depth of 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of the nodes and edges in this binary tree are labeled in a particular way. The node labels, represented by a letter and a question mark. The question mark is meant to remind you that that is a perception. This is the sensory input. So if we take, for example, this cube here and assume that this tree controller is running inside the cube, at every time step of the simulation, this cube starts running its controller at the root node at the top, and this cube asks itself the following question. Do I have a neighbor on my B side? In this case, the answer is obviously no. There's no neighbor to the B direction of this cube. So the answer is no. It's a binary tree, so that each of the pair of edges emanating out from a node are the answer to the question, yes or no. So in the no, when we travel down the no side, we have an additional action associated with each edge, which in this case is the turning on and off of magnets. So we have a neighbor sensor. Is there a neighbor on my B side? And the action is switching on and off these electric magnets. So on the left side of every edge, if the cube is descending through its controller and passes through a right-hand edge, it's going to try and turn off that magnet. If it travels down the left-hand side, it's going to try and turn on that magnet. As I mentioned, this tree goes 4 deep. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 possible magnets, A, B, C, and D. Yeah? Okay, so for this particular cube, in this particular example, it came down the no edge, it traveled down the right-hand edge, so it's going to turn off its A magnet, which is this one here, which has no effect, because there's no neighbor on that edge. Yeah? Okay. We come to the next one. In this particular controller, in this particular controller, it asks itself, is there a neighbor on my D edge? In this case, the answer is yes. So it travels down the left-hand edge, and it's going to turn on the B magnet. Everybody see that? Okay. What happens if there's a change in the controller? How does that influence the behavior of the cube, or does it? Think about the neural network controllers in your simulated robots. You change the synaptic weight, and what happens?
Sometimes everything changes, sometimes nothing changes.
Sometimes there's a huge behavioral impact. Sometimes little or nothing seems to happen. Same thing here, right? So we don't have a neural network controller. We have a controller in the shape of a tree, but we can change the node labels. We're going to leave the edge labels as they are. Any change to a node label changes how that cube responds to sensation or perception. Everybody see that? Okay. As promised, each cube contains 3 binary trees. The first one corresponds to a particular set of actions, which is turning on and off magnets. The second binary tree has the same structure. It's a binary tree of depth of depth 4. We have node labels and edge labels. The node labels are the same as in the first tree. They are sensation. So the cube is asking itself questions about its neighbors. As it travels down through this second tree, there's a second set of possible actions this robot can perform, which is to swivel about its diagonal. Yeah? So at every time step, this cube is going to execute this controller. It's going to descend in some direction down through this tree until it gets to a leaf node. And then it is also going to descend down this second tree. In the first tree, it's switching on and off magnets. As it descends this second tree, it is swiveling or not swiveling about various axes. Yeah? So let's have a look at this cartoon example again here. So in this case, this cube is asking itself, do I have a neighbor to my A direction? In this case, the answer is no. So it descends the left-hand edge. And this top level is associated with swiveling about the AB axis. So if we take this cube here, it's going to rotate. About A and B. So this half of the cube comes out of the plane, or at least the 2 edges of this half cube come out of the plane, and it rotates. And after this cube has descended from here to here, B will be next to C, and A will be next to D. Everybody see that? Okay. If it had descended through the right-hand edge, it would not have rotated in this particular way. Yeah? Okay. I'm not going to draw out this whole tree again, but again, the second tree has a depth of 4. At the top level edges dictate whether or not it swivels about AB. The second level dictates whether it swivels about CD. So if it does swivel about CD, C and D here are going to rotate, and so are all the other pieces that are attached to CD. So in this case, if this cube triggers swivel CD, everything here except this half cube is going to rotate up and out of the plane and back into the plane. It's a little bit physically unrealistic. It's hard to imagine how this thing has enough weight to anchor the rotation of this big piece here. But this is simulation land. We'll assume it's possible. Yeah. Okay. 1, 2, 3. At the third level edges, it's going to trigger whether or not the robot swivels about AC. So in that case, there is a second cut point, which is not shown in this figure, in which this cube will swivel about AC, and this unit plus the AC half of this cube will rotate up out of the plane and back into the plane. Yeah. So a simpler way to think about this is in the simulated case, each cube has 2 motors, one that can rotate about one cut point and the other motor that can rotate about the other diagonal cut point. So far, so good? Details don't matter too much, just that we're imagining this cube switching on and off magnets and swiveling or not about its various axes. Okay. Third and final binary tree, also of depth 3. Same as before, the individual node labels is the cube detecting whether or not it has neighbors in various directions. And at each level of the tree, when it hits those edges, it's going to try and attempt to copy this triplet of binary trees into a neighboring cube. I told you that we're not building in self-replication. This is kind of a step towards self-replication that is built into this experiment, which is an attempt to just inject your instructions into a neighboring machine or cell or organism.
And the idea is that the neighboring cubes are initially blank, right?
They're not initially blank. I haven't mentioned that yet. What you're going to see in the simulation in a moment, when we start the simulation, they're going to sprinkle a whole bunch of cubes into a grid world like we've seen before. And then for every cube, they're going to generate 3 random binary trees of depth 4. And they're going to randomly assign node labels to those trees.
But they still have the same sort of action.
They have the same possible actions, right? So each cube can turn on and off magnets, swivel yes or no, and attempt to try and overwrite its triplet of trees into a neighbor. But they're all going to have random controllers, so they're all going to try and do this differently. So far, so good? Okay. A couple of other details given that question. If, for example, this particular cube triggers an attempt to try and copy its triplet of trees into the neighbor in its D direction, just below it, we're always going to assume that that action is successful. No matter what controller is inside this one, it is going to be overwritten by the triplet of trees coming from this one. It's possible that 2 connected modules are going to try and copy their tree triplets into each other, in which case they both succeed. Yeah? So far, so good? Okay. No evolution here. No self-replication in the sense of self. So when we say self-replication, what do we mean by self? Self here is going to represent a set of connected cubes that do the same thing, right? We might have replication of a controller from one cube to another. So in a strict sense, there is some replication going on. We copy a controller from one cube to another. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're replicating behavior or the replication of replicative behavior. Everybody see that distinction? Question?
It's kind of because we're not replicating the body plan necessarily, just how it acts in a certain situation.
Absolutely. How that particular cube acts in that situation. You're right. So if we consider this the body plan, this set of 6 cubes as the body, one part of the body is trying to write information perhaps into another part of the body. Or if these 2 nodes are not connected, their magnets are not turned on, we could consider this cube as a different body, and now we're trying to copy our code into a different body, right? There is absolutely no reason why this form and function, whatever this thing tends to do on average, no guarantee that this thing is being copied, right, or replicated. Any other questions before we move on? Unfortunately, in this experiment, they did not report a simulation, so we're going to have to content ourselves with screenshots like we did before. Can I zoom in on this? Maybe? No. Okay. Okay. Here is the state of play at time step 1. We have a grid world like we saw before. All the black units are unoccupied cells. All the colored pixels are individual cubes. What do you think the different colors represent? Different controllers, right? So they just look at a given controller and they assign that set of that controller a particular RGB value. And if there are any other controllers in that world that have exactly the same triplet of trees, they get exactly the same color.
So just to clarify, was there a primary controller they were looking at with a bunch of other randoms in the area, or is it just a bunch of random ones?
They're all random.
Okay.
All random. For each one of these non-black pixels, imagine you create 3 binary trees with empty node labels. You visit every node, you roll a four-sided die, and you write into that node A, B, C, or D according to that die. Go to the next node, fill it in, next node, fill it in. This is pretty much exactly how you create random controllers at the beginning of one of your evolutionary algorithms, which is assigning random values to random weights to synapses, right? Exactly the same thing here. If you squint carefully, you'll notice that no two colors are alike here. There are some that are kind of close, but that's just a trick of the visualization here. All the controllers are unique. The probability that you're going to create a triplet of trees with 2 to the 4, however many nodes that is, where they all have exactly the same node labels is 0. Maybe not quite 0. There might be a couple in here that are identical. But generally speaking, we have unique random controllers. So far, so good? Okay. Oops. $750 time steps later, what's happening?
You're getting clusters of identical controllers.
So there's some identical controllers. Yeah, absolutely, right? So there's definitely several pixels that have the same color. Tell me about the pixels that have the same color. How are they distributed throughout this world?
And right now it seems that, and like for example, the green ones are all over, but they seem to be doing the best besides that one blue one right below it in the middle.
This one?
Yeah.
Yep.
So it seems like the green ones are doing their best to spread wherever they initially started off. And they seem to be so far doing pretty well.
Yep. So there, you can notice there's a couple of blotches of green that have more or less the same color, right? Those blotches are together. They're contiguous. What is that telling you? If you have several blotches, if you have several patches here that all have the same color, what does that tell you about what's happening in this world? It's not the controller. It's being spread, but spread how? It's spreading. The green controller is spreading through this world, but how is it spreading?
By proximity.
So by proximity. So there's some contiguous groups here. We can't tell from this picture whether the magnets are on, whether they're all connected, but there are touching cubes that all have identical controllers, right? They all have the green tree triplet inside. And there are multiple copies of them, or at least at this point, there's a couple of copies. This one looks like it's probably this one, and maybe this one down here. As always, this world is a toroid, or a donut, right? We take this black sheet of paper, we touch two edges together, and then take that cylinder and touch the two end circles together to make a donut, so things can move. Do we have self-replication? Why or why not?
It's more like the crystal growth we were talking about.
Okay, how so? How is this like crystal growth?
There's no division or body plan kind of recreation. You're kind of just adding to, I guess, one robot.
Possibly. If this was pure crystal growth, you would expect one color to start to grow outward, but that's it. There'd only be one blob, right? But there's multiple blobs here, at least a few. So we're actually already on the path to self-replication. However this green thing is doing it, it's made a copy of itself. If we look at this blob and this blob, they don't have exactly the same 3D shape. So it's a little bit difficult to tell whether they're identical copies of one another. But the fact that they both have identical controllers, and inside the body of each one, we have identical controllers. Why might they have different 2D shape, not 3D shape? Assuming they are copies of one another, what could be going on here?
It
They're just like different stages of motion or growth or something.
Absolutely, right? So at this particular freeze frame at time 750, they might be moving differently, right? They have the identical controllers, and over time, they might be doing the same thing, whatever that is. We just caught them in a different cycle of their behavior. Okay, let's keep going. See if I can get both of these panels on here. So this is time step 1,000, 250 time steps later. What's happening? What's happening, and where have we seen this before?
Seems like everything's happening on the edge. Like the middle is, they're like kind of migrating away from the middle, and there's just more controllers now.
Yep.
Seeing a lot more red.
Absolutely. So they're sort of they're probably moving out from this area. Whatever these replicators are starting to do, they're on the move. They're not just replicating, but they're moving around. Yeah. As you mentioned, there's a lot more red. So there must have been between time step 750 and time step 1,000, some sort of new controller or a controller that already existed that matched up with another part that allowed this replicative process to start. And it's maybe hard to see here, but there's definitely a lot more red than there was before, and it seems to be catching up on green. What's happening? We've got green replicators and red replicators. Tell me about the difference in replication between these two groups that you can guess at from this picture.
Red is replicating faster.
Red is replicating faster. If we keep going, still a bit of green, but red is definitely doing better.
Wouldn't the dominant species of controller be the one that copies its controller into its host the most? So the one that has the best neural tree with the most diversity?
Possibly. So assuming that red is replicating faster or better here, how? How might it be doing so? We talked about this a little bit at the beginning of this lecture. We looked at different kinds of replicators, and there's things that can happen to make sure that you're a better replicator than others. What might some of those general features be?
Maybe its replication process isn't easily interrupted, like it's robust from green attacks.
Okay, possibly. So maybe the replication process is more robust. Remember when we were looking at Penrose tiles, these wooden blocks? Even in that mechanical system, some of them were susceptible to cancer, right? Uncontrolled growth that would derail the replicative process. So it's possible that there's a triplet of trees that's more robust. However, it copies itself into a set of cubes so that that set of cubes starts moving and takes that red controller elsewhere in the world. During that process, there's less that can go wrong to disrupt replication, like, for example, being crashed into by the green replicators or some other group of replicators, like we saw in the Penrose tiles. Yeah? So having a robust replicative cycle is a good way to be a better replicator. What else?
It looks like red might make smaller units. Green just has a couple big clumps that are probably hard to move around. Red is a lot of smaller ones.
Absolutely, right? Many of us are wearing masks because if you're very small, it's easier to replicate, right? Viruses are extremely small. Being small and robust make you a really good replicator. Small, robust, one other feature that really, really helps. Being small, being able to resist external events as you're replicating, which is the robustness. It's the third thing.
Speed.
Speed, absolutely, right? So however this system However, the red system or the green system manages to inject its code into some other set of cubes that it crashes into. There has to be multiple copy events to get that controller into the entire external body, so that body starts acting like a red replicator. The faster you can do that, and the smaller you are, the fewer cubes you're composed of to make that happen, the more robust you are to things crashing into you, the better you're going to be able to replicate. Okay. At time step 1250, we've got the greens that are still alive, the reds that are doing a pretty good job in one part of the world, and some dark purple replicators, may be difficult to see with the lighting in this room. There is another group that is actually quite a bit spread out in here that seems to be doing well. Let's keep going.
Teal one, or
I'm sorry?
are you talking about the teal group, or?
Is there a teal group? There's multiple groups here. I'm talking about the dark purple one. Here's one of them. Here's another. Hard to see from where you're sitting, I suppose. Okay, you'll have to look at the slides yourself. Time step 2000, it looks like the greens are kind of rallying a little bit. Seems kind of odd. How might a system suddenly start to be doing better at replication? An important feature of this experiment is there's no mutation. When one controller is copied into another cube, there aren't replication mistakes. And yet the greens seem to be starting to do a better job. Any ideas why that might be the case?
They maybe like come across a new food source or something.
They might have come across a new food source. They might have moved into a different part of the world where there is material that they can turn into themselves, which might be additional just individual cubes that are sitting there swiveling and not doing much of anything. Or what's a better food source than that? A large population of what?
Another color.
Another color, right? Best food source you can find is a food source that also regenerates or replicates, right? Otherwise, you're going to eat it into zero sooner rather than later. Okay. It's not clear from this picture exactly what's going on. These are just all possibilities. Okay. What's happening at time 2250 in this world? Again, if you can't see it, the dark purple blobs are still around. There's some potential other species here. This might be crystal growth, right? We see kind of one mass of hot pink up here. There's kind of a hot pink shard down here, maybe another one down here. So this is maybe mostly growing by crystal growth. Maybe there's a little bit of self-replication going on here. At time step 3000, what's happening now? Pink is doing well. How is pink replicating differently from what we've seen so far in this particular world?
If I had to guess, it might be really good at taking over large clusters, but not necessarily spreading between, but it's really good at taking over large groups.
Okay, maybe it's really good at taking over large groups. At least these two hot pink pieces are much larger than anything we've seen before. So maybe it's not just crystal growth. Maybe it's just larger replicators, which we just mentioned, if you're a larger replicator like Homo sapiens, takes a while to replicate. But if you're bigger in this world and our world, you can move further, which means you might be able to move into an area with better food. Who knows? What's the state of play at time 4000 in this world? Got a lot of different replicating systems operating in parallel. Let's look at the last time step here. Time step 4500. Is that it? If we ran this forward to 40,000 or 400,000 or 4 million time steps? Would we see anything more interesting? What do you think, given what we've seen in the first 4,000 time steps? Is this process reaching steady state?
It's possible that this process could be reaching oscillatory state. Oscillatory state.
Yep.
thank you,
Yep.
Where it's the green tends to dominate and the red tends to dominate, gets into larger clusters, and the pink will take it over, and that will recombine it on one location. Then it will re-spread out as the new clusters and keep going like that.
Absolutely, right? So there's no reason that this has to converge on one set of replicators. We could get a co-evolutionary process. Maybe the pink replicators are picky eaters, like we saw before, and they can only eat green replicators. In which case, if there's lots of green replicators, great, there'll be more pink. But if there's more pink, they quote unquote eat more green, which means green will drop. And if green drops, pink can't spread. If, in the same way, green feeds on pink, you get a co-evolutionary process, right? In the Canadian Arctic, over 200 years ago now, during the fur trade, there was careful records made by the Hudson's Bay Company about how many hair and lynx pellets, pelts, thank you. Hair and lynx pelts were being brought in every winter for decades. And if you look at the log books, you see an oscillating pattern. One winter, lots of hair pelts, not many lynx pelts. The next winter, lots of lynx pelts, not so many hair pelts. Because, of course, these two species are still locked in a co-evolutionary struggle. Yeah? So we are maybe not in an evolutionary system yet. There's still not mutation and inheritance in the strict sense. But we are starting to see some co-evolutionary dynamics in this experiment. Yes?
Did they happen to plot the amount of different controllers within the group? Because eventually some controllers will die off.
Absolutely. I don't remember. I don't think so. But you can go and have a look at the paper and check. Yeah, good question. Good. Other questions?
How did they decide which controllers did their operations first? Wouldn't that provide an advantage to maybe some colors over the others?
Great question. Yep. So I haven't mentioned whether there is synchronous or asynchronous updating in the system. Synchronous is everyone does one operation and then we go on to the next one. If you do synchronous updating, the risk of giving someone an advantage or some group being able to exploit that advantage. In this case, that's the case in asynchronous updating. Everyone does their action one after the other. In this system, there is synchronous updating. Everybody performs an action in parallel. I gave you one example here where two neighboring cubes try and copy their controllers into each other, right? If we did asynchronous updating, one of them is going to get to go first. It's going to write its controller over the other one, and that second one would never have had a chance to attempt its copy operation. If we do synchronous updating, no one has an advantage.
Do you know what happens if it tries to move itself in a way where there's overlapping?
Great question. Yeah, so there are mechanical collisions that are possible. I don't remember. I think what they did is they just canceled out that action. If you tried to rotate in a way that would bring you down on an existing cube, it just canceled that swivel attempt. I think, but be sure to verify it in the paper itself. Okay, that concludes our discussion of self-replication and also this concept of collective robotics. We are going to return to self-replication in the very last lecture. As we just saw in lecture 23, for most of the history of the study of self-replication, it's been an abstract exercise, math or computer simulations. You just saw one robotic attempt, so there are a few robots that self-replicate if you provide them with materials. I was part of a team that last year discovered that biological robots will also self-replicate in the von Neumann sense. They will find material in their environment and turn it into copies of themselves, and we'll talk about that in more detail in lecture 27. For now, we're going to switch to this last part of the theme, where we're going to look at evolving bodies and brains. As I mentioned at the beginning of this course, evolutionary robotics is a very small field inside the much larger robotics and AI landscape, where in most of AI and robotics today, the study is on learning rather than evolution. Learning, by the very term, refers to adaptation that occurs inside of nervous systems. Yeah? But of course, evolution is a much broader adaptive process that alters not just nervous systems, but whole bodies, parts of bodies, bone, organs, cellular differentiation. It creates new kinds of bodies. The advantage of working with evolutionary algorithms over learning systems is we can look for different, or we or evolution can look for different bodies. Why would we bother looking for different robot bodies? Why not just make Spot the robot dog or Atlas the humanoid robot and plug our learning algorithms into those bodies? Why don't we make the bodies and let learning algorithms create controllers for them? We've got lots of examples in the natural world of body plans to choose from. Why might we want to allow evolution to design robot bodies rather than just design one by hand?
The body plans that sort of nature has selected for might only be optimal if they're controlled using the neural network brains that are also co-evolved.
Absolutely, right? So bodies and brains that we find in nature were evolved to fit very specific environmental niches. Yeah. If we build Atlas, the humanoid robot that has a human body plan, what's the problem there?
Does not have human sensors.
Doesn't have human sensors, right? It doesn't have all the sensors we have. Yeah. What are some other potential problems? Spent a lot of time in this course talking about embodied cognition now. Thinking about thinking is misleading. Thinking about body plans is misleading. What's the problem with building a 6-foot-tall, 300-pound machine and letting it loose in a built environment that was built for things that are about 6 feet tall and maybe 300 pounds, maybe less? What could possibly go wrong?
It's not safe.
It's not safe? Why not?
Is there any flaws in the learning process that we don't know about before we let it loose?
Possibly.
To hurt other things.
Okay, so we train a learning algorithm on the Atlas, the humanoid robot, and we let it loose in built environments. How do we know that it's going to act safely? How do we know that it's going to do what it's going to do? You are all let loose in a built environment. We trust most of you most of the time. What's the difference? So our sensory systems are very different, right? Atlas, from a distance, looks like us and kind of acts like us.
It generally has no goals or morals.
It has no goals or morals. If Bradenberg were here, he'd say, neither do you. You just think you do. But assuming you do, right, there is that difference. Maybe Atlas doesn't exactly have the same goals as us. What else?
Well, maybe you want to, thinking about creating bodies misleading, thinking about thinking is misleading. So why would we create something that already exists? Let an evolutionary robot figure it out.
Okay.
Maybe more applicable for our lives.
Okay, we want to make it more applicable, more closer to us, right? We look kind of like Atlas, and it kind of looks like us. What are some other important differences?
I think an important thing why we trust other people and not necessarily robots is you can't really as easily communicate with a robot as you can with another person. You can't ask it, what's on its mind? What are you thinking about going? What are you going to do if I did this?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So remember our discussion about language and embodied metaphors. Would Atlas understand, I'm looking forward to you opening the door for me in 10 seconds time so I can walk through? So there's the language part, and we saw how language is tied to the body, so that may be part of it. What else?
It's like when we get let loose to run around and learn, like I feel like our brains have really strong priors built in. So like some things are automatic and we're kind of inclined to learn certain things. But if you just have like a raw, randomly initialized neural network, it's not going to learn how to move around a human body really well.
Okay, now we're getting to the crux of it, right? So when we're born, our brains have priors in them, right? There are instincts that are in there already, right? Our factory settings have been set already. Atlas, again, this is kind of picking on Atlas a little bit, but usually it's just an empty machine, right? There are no priors. We put our learning software in there and hope for the best. Atlas has to start from scratch. We don't. Where are our priors coming from? The instincts that you're born from, where did they come from?
Evolution.
They came from evolution, right? Your human ancestors and your primate ancestors before that, your mammalian ancestors before that, your reptilian ancestors before that, all the way back, right? We are robots built of robots. The cells of which you are composed, each cell inherits 3.5 billion years worth of its ancestors who survived the school of hard knocks, the world out there, for 3.5 billion years. That's quite a bit, right? That's quite a bit of knocking around. Yeah. So that is a very important difference, right? We inherit a lot of competency from our ancestors, some of which had body plans almost indistinguishable from us. Your parents, great-grandparents, going back maybe 50 or 100 generations, anatomically indistinguishable. But that's not your only inheritance. Your inheriting competency from all your ancestors going back billions of years to organisms that had very different body plans from you, which should now seem a little bit non-intuitive, right? What could a single-celled ancestor have learned or acquired in its way of surviving in the world that is also useful for you? Okay, let's treat that as not a rhetorical question. What is it that you could possibly benefit from a single-celled ancestor?
The coevolution of mitochondria in the cells.
So coevolution exists in lots of different species, and also it is coevolution all the way down, right, to the cellular and subcellular level. There is coevolutionary benefit between your cell and the things that exist inside it, like mitochondria. The very first cells, like we just saw in the replicator experiment, they need to get around, they need to find food, they need to get enough oxygen. If they're surrounded too much and they don't get any oxygen, cells will starve and die very, very quickly. The cells that make up your body, some of them migrate, some of them move about inside your body. Your body is the environment for your cells, right? You are a machine made of machines, made of machines, made of machines, all the way down. Okay, so when we start to look at this from an evolutionary point of view and what evolution gave us to benefit our ability to survive and move around in this world, we are building on a very, very, very long tradition of survivors. That is very, very different from Atlas. Atlas does not benefit from parents, grandparents, doesn't have any. What else? Related to that evolutionary theme, there's another huge difference between you and Atlas. It's not the obvious things that you're not built out of metal and plastic. We just focused on this evolutionary part on different body plans, right? Some of your benefits are inherited from ancestors that looked and acted nothing like you. Or did they? Did you ever resemble your single-celled ancestors? Of course not. You're 6 foot tall, made up of billions of cells, right? When you start out, right? Development, there's an old saying that development recapitulates evolution. It's a very controversial statement. It's not quite true in a lot of its details, but in general outline, it's true. Over your last 15, 20, 25 years on this planet, your body and brain have gone through a lot of the steps that your ancestors went through over 3.5 billion years. So not only did your ancestors have to survive in a single-celled form, you did as well. You needed to survive long enough to become two cells. When you were two cells, you had to act in a way that you survived to become 4, then 8, then 16. Congratulations to all of you. You are still successfully doing it, right? We all experience radical change in terms of our anatomy and our nervous system over many, many orders of magnitude of spatial extent, right? You used to be this big, now you're this big. Yeah? Most robots today experience none of that. Why is that an advantage for us? It seems like just an additional challenge, right? Why don't we just make things easier on Atlas and do what we do with Atlas robots, which is just build them once, they never change shape, and just allow them to learn to do what they need to do in the real world.
Kind of allows a creature or a robot to recycle what they knew from what they know or instinctually have from older generations to build forward really quickly, I guess.
Okay.
So we're only a cell, use what we gain from being one cell to be able to be 2 cells and 4 cells, as opposed to having to evolve that through different generations.
Absolutely, right? So we're gathering experience as we change somehow, right? We're building on it, right? You were able to survive from one day to the next, from a single cell up to a trillion cell organism. If you're able to adapt to those internal changes, then adapting to external changes like a fire alarm going off and having to figure out what to do is trivial by comparison, right? Even, knock on wood, a relatively serious emergency where things have really changed, you're now faced with an experience you've never experienced in your lifetime. If you think about it, a lot of those seemingly catastrophic external events are child's play compared to what you've already been able to achieve. You constantly adapt and deal with massive amounts of internal change, and it's possible that pre-trains you for being able to adapt and get along in the real world. For anyone who's taken a machine learning course or follows the latest development in machine learning, there's a lot of excitement in the literature these days about this idea of pre-training. These language models that seem to be able to give you back a cogent English response to a question written in English. If you pre-train them just to generate random English sentences, so you teach them English first, you pre-train them to learn English, and then you ask them a question in English, it has been surprising to many people in the community that it seems a small step. It takes relatively little additional learning to get them to give you the right English sentence response to your question. Yeah? That's the hope for evolutionary robotics and developmental robotics, where we're going to roll back this assumption that the body plan is fixed. We're not going to make Spot the dog. We're not going to make Atlas the robot. We're going to evolve bodies, and some of those bodies themselves can change. Yeah? Okay. All right, that's a long lead up to lecture 24, where we're going to actually go all the way back in time to the beginning of evolutionary robotics itself. I mentioned several times in this course that the age of physics engines began in the year 2000, which is true. That's when the first commercially available physics engines appeared. But Carl Sims, a computer graphics researcher, in the early 1990s created his own physics engine and created an evolutionary algorithm. And evolutionary algorithms had been around since the 1960s. That was an old technology already at that time. Made his own physics engine, created an evolutionary algorithm, and put them together and started to evolve these virtual creatures. And again, I apologize, the audio is not going to work here, so I will do my best to navigate over to narrate over this for you. Here's Sims turning off gravity in his world.
Still air friction or something?
Sorry?
There's still air friction?
Yeah, so he's simulating aerodynamics here, or hydrodynamics a little bit. So he's building the simulation of air or water on top of his physics engine. So computer graphics researchers, so you also put in shadows and shading and ray tracing. We talked about perverse instantiation, getting solutions which in retrospect are maybe not what you expected. Here's some early examples of embodied perverse instantiation.
So do these have gravity now? Or-
These have gravity, yeah. You'll notice that a lot of these body plans have repeated parts. We'll come back to that when we look at the details of how Sims pulled this off. There's some bilateral symmetry. Left side of the body looks like the right side of the body. Here's the evolution of jumping. For those that are working on that as a final project, some inspiration here. Here's phototaxis. This is phototaxis. Here's phototaxis where you'll see Sims is actually manually moving a light source in the environment. You can see in real time this evolved phototacting creature or creatures are able to change direction and chase the light. They are photophilic, light-loving. Okay, we just finished talking about coevolution. So we just saw walking, swimming, jumping, phototaxis. Now we're going to look at the last series of experiments that Sims implemented, which is coevolution. So we'll see the details, I guess, next time, but just to paint a picture in your mind, we have two evolving populations. In each population, we have virtual creatures. We're going to try and compute, or the evolutionary algorithm is going to compute the fitness of each individual in each of the two populations. But the fitness is not going to be how that robot does in its own environment. Fitness is going to be how that robot does relative to another robot from the other population. Yeah? What do you think that relative fitness value is?
How close they get to the block, or
How close they get to the block. So the fitness of this particular creature on the left is how close it gets to the block. That's part of the fitness function that's applied to each robot here. There's a second term, which is what?
Time spent touching the block?
Possibly, could be.
And how far the block is from the other room.
How far the block is from the other robot. Yeah. So I am only as good as how good I do and how poorly I make the other robot perform. Got it? Okay, that's the fitness function. Here we go. Not so fast. Pretty smart. Some pretty aggressive strategies. Some even more aggressive strategies. This one just gives up. Do these robots love the block? Hate the block? Hate their competitor? Get frustrated and become aggressive? Of course not, right? We do, but we're different. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so that's the Sims experiment. Conducted in 1994. Think about the technology that was available in the early 1990s. No laptops, or at least maybe the beginnings of laptops. You'll notice there was some pretty fancy graphics in there as well, like real-time ray tracing. What machine do you think Sims was running all this on? For those that know their history of computers. There's only a few computers on the planet that would have been capable of this at the time. No? The computer that he ran this on appeared in Jurassic Park. There it is in the background, flicking its lights on and off. This is probably the most famous supercomputer at the time, the Connection Machine 5. We'll talk about CM5 in a moment. The Connection Machine was built by a particular company, Thinking Machines Corporation, that produced these supercomputers. And a couple years before Sims reported these results, Thinking Machines approached Carl Sims, who was a very well-known computer graphics researcher at the time, and they said, we want to make a whiz-bang demo to show off the ability of our new supercomputer. Do you have any ideas? That's where this came from. Yeah. So all of this was performed on the Connection Machine 5. Why was it called 5? Because there were a number of cores. There were 1,024 cores, and each core inside the computer was attached to 5 neighbors. So if you think about all of these components attached together, they're attached together in a lattice in 5 dimensions. Every single one of these cores has 5 neighbors. Yeah. It was able to reach in the 90s a peak of 131 giga floating point operations per second. My Mac Pro, which is up here, or sorry, this is my MacBook Pro. I have a Mac Pro at home. It's a little bit slower than the CM machine. It's definitely smaller, but not quite as fast as the Connection Machine. So a pretty amazing machine at the time. Yeah. The fact that it had this parallelism, that it had multiple cores, and those cores could communicate with their neighbor, seemed perfectly well suited for an evolutionary algorithm in which Sims could evaluate multiple virtual creatures in parallel, in the same way that some of you are evaluating some of your multiple virtual creatures in parallel on your multi-core machines. Yeah. For a lot of the results you see here, it took about 3 hours to get a result. Not bad. Not bad. Okay. We've got 5 minutes left, so we'll just start to dig into a little bit of the details here. We've seen lots of different genotypes and phenotypes in this course so far. The genotype, again, is the genetic instructions or the way in which the robots are encoded. And the phenotypes, as you just saw, are robots that have different bodies and different brains. Yeah. The genotypes in this case, unlike the genetic algorithm in which genotypes are encoded as strings of numbers, or genetic programming in which the genotypes are coded as trees, in this case the genotypes are nested, directed multigraphs, and we'll unpack what that means. The phenotypes are simulated robots with different morphologies and controllers. And the mapping, the way that we're going to turn a genotype into a phenotype, relies on a recursive algorithm. We've talked about genotypes, we've talked about phenotypes. We haven't really talked about how you go from one to the other, because usually that mapping is straightforward. In your code base, you pull numbers out of a vector and you plug them into a matrix, which is the controller for your robot. The mapping is kind of trivial. Mapping is not trivial here. Let's look at these 3 different genotypes for a moment. We can see that they're, first of all, graphs. We have a bunch of nodes and edges. Each node is actually going to have multiple labels inside that dictate certain aspects of an individual segment, or in our case, it would be a link that makes up the robot. And as we travel from one node to the next, When we arrive at a new node, we create that body part, and we connect that new body part back to the body part we just created using edge labels. So when we traverse the edge, it's going to tell us how to connect the newly constructed body part to the body part we just created. Okay. It's called a multigraph because it's possible to have multiple edges that go from one node to the other. Most graphs, there's at most one edge that can go from one node to another. In this case, we have a multi-graph, and it's directed because the edges have points here. They point from one edge to the other. We haven't got to the nested part yet. We'll get to the nested part. Given what I've just told you, and given the 3 genotypes you see over here and the 3 phenotypes you see over here, tell me about the mapping. How do you think this mapping works? It's got a recursive aspect to it. You can kind of intuit some of the details just from these 3 genotype to phenotype mappings. Any ideas? Information inside a node tells us how to make a body part for the robot, and labels attached to the edges tell us how to connect body parts together. I'm obviously not showing you any of the node labels or the edge labels yet. How do you think this process works?
Provided you start in the right location, the arrows kind of tell you how many of each part to make at a given time step.
Yep.
And then so like for the tree, you're always branching up into 2
Uh,
separate branches, and you keep on doing that, so it keeps on forking into 2 at each next segment.
Absolutely, right? So the easiest one here is the tree, right? There's only one node, so we know where the mapping is going to start. It starts inside this node. And apparently there's information in here that says how to build this particular part. We then follow these 2 edges outward, which bring us back to the same node. So we're hitting that node another 2 times. And each time we do, we're building 2 more pieces. They have more or less the same geometry, the same length, width, and height. So you can start to figure out that length, width, and height is stored inside a node. But you'll notice that they have different 3D orientations relative to the part they're connected to. So the edge indicates information about relative features between the parts. So in essence, what this genotype is saying is build a rectangular solid, and then these 2 edges will say turn to the left, and the other edge will say turn to the right. So we're storing sort of orientation information. And now when you get here, place 2 new blocks at those orientations, and then connect them back to the segment you just made, which is this one. And it's recursive. We go back out along the 2 edges again, and back out along the 2 edges again, and back out along the 2 edges again. Because this is a recursive process, this would continue indefinitely unless there is some additional information inside the genotype that says stop under these conditions. The base case for those of you that remember your recursive algorithms. Yeah. Okay, I think we will pause there today. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on your A/B testing. See you Thursday morning. Thanks very much.